Yeah, so we're good to go.
Okay. I think we can start. Uh, if you're all ready. Yes. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar. I'm Senior Resident Fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. And welcome to the third talk in our series on the judiciary as the conscience keeper of the Constitution. In this particular discussion, we'll be talking about the master of the roster. And for those of you who are not very familiar with the concept, it is talking about the powers of the Chief Justice, not just of India, but also of various high courts to sort of decide who hears what case and what kinds of cases in the court of their concern. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction about this series, we are at a point of time in India history when public faith in institutions and democracy appears to be diminishing. And the long cherished belief in the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court as a protector of the common person's right, has come under the scanner. It is an important moment to start a conversation on how judiciary is and can continue to be a foundational building block of our democracy, both in an attempt to understand the present state of affairs and offer solutions. So, which is why we at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy are organizing a series of public conversations titled Conscience Keeper Judiciary as the Constitutional Guardian. It is a series of four conversations spread over our Constitutional Law Month. These conversations will address some of the most pressing concerns of our time, including judiciary and constitutional courage, freedom, unlawful restriction of freedom of speech, and the nature of federalism in India, among other topics. This series is being organized in affiliation with the Kautilya Society at the National Law University of Odisha, one of Vidhi's several student societies. And we hope to take this conversation forward with you for the larger public good. But today I am joined by Dr. Aparna Chandra, who is an associate professor at the National Law School of India University. She has previously taught at the National Law University, Delhi, and she has worked with the Law Commission and has done some pioneering, cutting edge research on the topic of the judiciary and continues to do so. You should follow her work on her page at the National Law School of India University. She has been somebody who we have spoken to, consulted with, and sought advice on a lot of issues. So therefore, it gives me great pleasure to invite her to this conversation. Welcome, Dr. Aparna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So just let's to get right into the topic. And today we sort of intend this to be a little bit more of a conversation rather than me interviewing you about sorts of specific things. But we want to cover many aspects of this issue of the master of the roster. And I want to start by giving our listeners some context on why is it that we're even discussing this topic in 2020, because on paper this has been the way things have been done almost since the day we got a high court in this country, the presidency high courts and all the major courts in this country. You think, why is it that this has become an issue in 2020? There is an immediate context to this, and those of you who might remember will remember what happened in 2017 when an attempt was made to highlight the fact that there were allegations that then Chief Justice of India, Deepak Mishra, might have been involved in a potential bribery scandal with regard to the medical education cases. A newspaper report had emerged which suggested that one of the persons accused in that case had been in constant touch with someone in the Chief Justice of India's residence. This matter was brought before the Supreme Court by Mr. Prashant Bhushan and the Campaign for Judicial Accountability, and they said that this is a matter which needs to be investigated. Now, obviously, since the Chief Justice of India himself, then Deepak Mishra, was allegedly the subject matter of this issue, the case went before Justice Chalameshwar, who was the number two in the court, the second senior most judge after the Chief Justice of India. And he said that this is serious. We need to do something about this. So let it be the five senior most judges apart from the Chief Justice of India who examined this issue. This happened in the morning. And I remember this is a sequence of events. Those of you who follow it will also remember this. This happened in the morning. And those who were in court were stunned because this is a first of its kind order. That this issue was serious. The order was also fairly unprecedented. And a lot of people who were in Justice Deepak Mishra's courtroom, who was Chief Justice of India, literally next door, said that at one point of time, a bearer, an attender came to the Chief Justice, slipped a note, and the Chief Justice recused himself. No, he didn't recuse himself, he excused himself from an ongoing hearing and adjourned the proceedings. Before anyone knew what happened, a quote-unquote constitution bench of 5 judges was constituted, to hear this exact same case where the order by Justice Chalameshwar was passed, saying that this order could not have been passed, and recalling that order, asserting that only the Chief Justice of India, as the master of the roster, could have decided who the case could have gone to, and therefore recalling that order and then saying that the Chief Justice will place this matter before an appropriate bench. Now, matter came up again. The appropriate bench was constituted with with Arun Mishra heading that bench, and the case was sort of closed, saying that nothing to investigate here, move along. In January of 2018, we all remember what happened. We saw the 4 senior most judges of the Supreme Court of India undertake a press conference for the first time in the lawns of one of their residences, saying they are deeply distressed by the way in which the Chief Justice of India was allocating cases. The immediate trigger, and this was based on what one of the judges said during the press conferences, was the fact that the case concerning the investigation of the death of Judge Loya, B.H. Loya of the Maharashtra judiciary, had been placed before Justice Arun Mishra against the representation made by the 4 other senior judges of the Supreme Court. This was an unprecedented state of affairs. There was complete chaos. No one knew what was going on, what was happening. But at the end of the day, nothing happened. In the sense, the maximum that happened was that the case was transferred from Justice Arun Mishra's court to the Chief Justice's court himself. And we had that case also closed in a long judgment, which some of you may have read. But this issue hasn't died away. We've had at least 2 attempts made afterwards by various lawyers, including Mr. Shanti Bhushan and Kamini Jaiswal, saying this is not how cases should be listed in the Supreme Court of India. The primary concern was that cases which the government seems to be interested in or has a stake in is going before a particular judge who seems to be favorably inclined to the government. And this is having a bearing on the confidence with which people view the judiciary. However, in both these cases, the Supreme Court said nothing doing. We are not going to interfere with this. The way things are the way things are. You have to learn to live with it and accept it. So here we are in 2020, and we have seen, and at least what we are seeing, if you have followed the coverage of what has happened in the Supreme Court in the last 1 year, we've seen a lot of commentators express anguish, not just say the likes of Mr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta and others, but also top lawyers and judges like Justice A.P. Shah and Justice Madan Lokur, saying that this is not how the Supreme Court should be run. The Supreme Court is letting us all down. The Supreme Court is failing us. So at the heart of this seems to be, and if I have to really coalesce this issue around the topic of discussion, is the way in which our Supreme Court is choosing to hear certain cases and choosing not to hear certain cases. And it's at 2 levels. We'll come to that and we'll discuss that with Aparna in a little bit. One is who gets to hear what cases and what cases are even being heard. So Aparna, let's start off this discussion. And I think we have to understand, as the law people in India, this is a topic none of us discussed in law school. We are only all finding out about it as we go along. But as someone who studies the Constitution and the judiciary, perhaps we could start a little bit by discussing what is the historical origin of this idea of the master of the roster.
See, the idea behind the master of the roster is fairly simple. Whenever you have multi-panel courts, right, where you have multiple benches, you have to have some mechanism to decide which bench will hear what case. This will not be a problem, for example, in the US, where all the judges sit together. So all cases go before all benches. But in places like India, you have to have some mechanism to decide. Now, historically, it has been the case and comes also from, it was expressly there in the Government of India Act 1935 and has been part of the Supreme Court rules post-independence. This power has vested with the Chief Justice of India, at least at the Supreme Court level. And as you mentioned, the Chief Justices of the various high courts for the high courts. And basically the power is this. See, on the judicial side, the Chief Justice of India is called primus inter pares. Primus inter pares meaning first amongst equals. So the vote of the Chief Justice of India counts equally with all other judges. The Chief Justice of India does not have any higher vote or any higher say on the judicial side. He's as the senior most judge on any given bench, he, and I'm using the word he only because it's been a he so far, but they, I should say, they preside over the bench. So that is the primus part. But on the administrative side, the Chief Justice of India is the head of the institution, and all the administrative power, including the rostering power, vests with the Chief Justice. So that means that the Chief Justice constitutes benches, assigns and allocates cases to benches, and has the power of listing as well, right? So that's the listing power of when cases get decided, which when cases come up for hearing, which we will come to in a bit. And that power is mostly exercised through the registry. But when it comes to the rostering power, there are two different types of rostering that happens. One is your routine subject-wise rostering. So each judge is given a certain set of subjects, and then the Chief Justice allocates which judge will hear which subjects, and then matters are routinely sent by the registry, depending on the subject matter, to that judge or to that bench. And if I can just share my screen briefly, I can show you what the roster looks like currently. So this is the roster. If you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
We can see. Yes, we can see the screen.
So this is the latest roster on the Supreme Court website. And if you see, the Chief Justice of India has kept certain matters with himself, and then has assigned other subject matters to, say, for example, Justice Ramana is hearing these set of subject matters. So cases falling under these subject matters will routinely be sent from the registry onto Justice Ramana. This is by and large uncontroversial. Where the controversy comes in is the case specific assignment. So when the Chief Justice has to constitute a 3-judge bench or a 5-judge bench, the Chief Justice gets to decide who sits on that bench and hear the particular matter. And that is where the concern arises, that the Chief Justice might strategically assign cases to benches in order to come up with particular outcomes. Right. And you mentioned that this is a recent controversy, and it's a recent public controversy. Academics have been concerned about this for quite some time. And if I can again share my screen, I can show you some statistics, both from our own studies more recently, but also studies dating back to the 1970s, which were raising this concern. Because remember, the first time this concern actually comes up is the first super session.
Yes.
Because in 1973, when Justice Ray supersedes Justice Sheila Hegde and Grover, the question is, why is Indira Gandhi bucking the trend and signing an against such huge furor is superseding the other judges? What is she going to get out of it? And the only reason why this makes sense, I mean, there's one theory is that this was a reward, but really she didn't win. So what was she rewarding someone for? And the other theory is that this was a reward because she was losing and she needed, quote unquote, her guy on the in place to be able to set up benches in her favor. And it is using that academics of that time started studying the role of the Chief Justice in setting up benches. So I'll take you through some of that data, but just to say also that historically the court has again, I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. Go ahead.
Okay. Historically, this court is very different. The court of today is very different from the court of 1950. And the power of the Chief Justice has only increased as the court has changed in its form. So remember that in 1950, there were only 1,037 cases that were instituted in the Supreme Court, right? So the Supreme Court received only 1,037 petitions, including both writ petitions and appeal petitions. In 2019, for which we have the latest data, in the first 10 months, it had received 35,000 plus petitions. And this itself is contrary to the trend of the past 10 years, where the court has been receiving about 60,000 petitions. We don't know if this is an anomaly or this is the start of a new trend. But if you average out over the last 10 odd years, the court receives around 60,000 petitions a year. So it's a huge volume of cases. To deal with that huge volume of cases, the court has taken 2 steps, both of which have ended up increasing the power of the Chief Justice. One, it has increased the number of judges from 8 to 34. So there are more judges to assign cases to. Second, the court that used to sit in large benches now rarely sits in large benches. So the
Right.
bulk of the work, the court is sitting in smaller and smaller benches. Today, our data finds that the bulk of the work of the court is carried out by 2-judge benches. And it's not very
Right.
surprising to anyone who knows anything about the working of the contemporary court, but about 87% of all cases are being decided by 2-judge benches, and almost everything else is by 3-judge benches. So the
Benches.
proportion of larger benches has gone down. So what do we have? We have more judges, we have more cases, and we have smaller benches. So there are more cases to assign to smaller benches, which means that the person who is doing the assigning gets more
power. Actually, this is an
Yeah.
important point. Aparna, can I just say sort of, I
Yeah,
want to
sure.
bring one very key point here. And you mentioned this also at the beginning of, the discussion, that unlike the US Supreme Court, where all the judges sit together, our Supreme Court judges sit in different groups, right? And I know you want to get to that, but I just sort of want to highlight this one thing. We often say the Supreme Court, but it need not necessarily be on paper. It may mean the Supreme Court, but our Supreme Court speaks in so many different voices. Should we think of it as one Supreme Court or 14, 15, as the case may be?
Right. And that's what Nick Robinson has called the polyvocality of the court. That was
Right.
the last point on this
Right.
slide. But
Hmm.
each bench speaks with the entire institutional authority of the entire Supreme Court, right? So
Right,
you're
yes.
speaking with the authority of the entire Supreme Court, but you're really two judges taking a call on a huge, on perhaps a very important matter. So the
Yeah.
power of individual judges is also increased because
Yes.
of the number of cases on the smaller bench size. Each small bench of 2 judges is deciding for the entire court.
Yeah.
And that means that all the tempering effect that you have of sitting in large benches, of deliberating with a large number of judges, so on and so forth, also gets reduced. But
Yeah.
since we are interested in the question of master of the roster, what it does immediately for the power of the Chief Justice is that the power of the Chief Justice really increases. So that's
Yeah.
really a context in which the power of the Chief Justice has become even more important for the current court as compared to the court in 1950. Now, just to tell you very quickly about the concerns that were raised. So I mentioned to you academics writing in the 1970s, and in particular George Gadboy, who's done pioneering and fantastic work on data on the courts. He is looking at this issue in 1976, and he has a data set of all decisions by the court between 1950 and 1967. So that's the period that he's studying. And he says that, if you look at all the disputes that have the government on one side and the individual on the other side, then you can construct what is the proclivity of a given judge, a given Chief Justice, to decide in favor of the individual versus the government. And he said that if you see this, if you measure how likely a Chief Justice is to decide in favor of the individual versus the government, you can also measure whether the court under that Chief Justice also decides in that same particular way, right? And he finds, it's a bit of a complex point, but he finds that there is a positive correlation. That is, if the Chief Justice is more likely to rule in favor of the individual versus the government in all of his cases, then the court under that Chief Justice, even where the Chief Justice is not on a particular bench, so in all the judgments taken together, the court under that Chief Justice will also move towards the individual. Where a Chief Justice is more likely to rule in favor of the government, the court as a whole also moves towards the government. And there's a very positive correlation between these. So that's a surprising thing, right? And that goes to indicate that there's some impact of who the Chief Justice is on how decisions are being taken across the board. But he has this fantastic example of Justice Subba Rao. So Justice Subba Rao was called in his time the great dissenter. He had written in that time the largest number of dissents. So he had dissented in 48 of the 466 cases that he had heard as a puisne judge, as not as a Chief Justice, as before he became a Chief Justice. So that's 10% of all cases he was a dissenter in. He was Chief Justice for 9.5 months. In those 9.5 months, he sat on 77 cases and gave 0 dissents.
Okay.
Right. So as the greatest number of the guy who gave the greatest number of dissents before he became the Chief Justice, suddenly is writing no dissents, even though there were 16 split decisions in his time.
Yes.
Right. And this was very startling, and we've all read those Subba Rao judgments, and we know that when he became the Chief Justice, he reversed a lot of those. A lot of his dissents now became majority opinions.
Yes.
Personally, I think he was right in a lot of those cases, but that's besides the point here. Similarly, Gadboy found that in the first 9 Chief Justices, only 3 of the 9 Chief Justices had ever been on a losing side in a split decision. So this is right from the very beginning.
Outset of the,
Outset. Nick Robinson finds that up to 2009, there were only 10 instances in 1532 Constitution Bench decisions dealing with constitution matters. It's not all Constitution Bench decisions, but he was studying Constitution Bench decisions dealing with constitution matters. 1532 of them, the Chief Justice was in a minority only in 10 of those. Right?
Wow.
Where overall there's a 15% dissent rate. So suddenly there's a question to ask: how is it that the Chief Justice is rarely in the minority? Is it that the Chief Justice who sets up the bench is rarely in a minority, right? We are finding that between 2010 and 2015, the CJI has never been in a minority, even though overall there's a dissent rate of 5.9%, right? And it's not as if that something is happening and Chief Justices are not dissenting. Chief Justices are dissenting at the same rate in smaller benches, right? As any other judge. But the moment they come to the to constitution benches where case specific assignment is happening, the Chief Justice is rarely in a minority. Now, this gets compounded by the fact that the Chief Justice over-assigns cases to himself. Again, I'm using himself here because it's in this set of cases that I'm looking at, 2010 to 15, it's been a him. Chief Justice has been over-assigning cases to himself. There is no correlation, for example, between the seniority of a judge and assignment on a 3 or 5 judge bench. We did that regression. There was no correlation. There's no correlation between whether you are in line to become a Chief Justice and your assignment on the bench. A Chief Justice is on in this data set of ours. Chief Justice was on the Constitution bench 88% of the time, and always in the majority. And so every other judge had about a 1 in 5 chance of being on the Constitution bench. Any other judge has about 1 in 5 chance of being on a Constitution bench. So if there are 5 Constitution benches that are created, he'll be on a Constitution bench in one of them. Chief Justice has a 1 in 1.14 chance of being in a Constitution bench, which is 88%, right? 88% chance of being on a Constitution bench. The over-assigning cases to himself, not following any seniority norm, is never in a dissent. We also found a trend, though we can't form a correlation, but we found an interesting trend that there are judges who are who are appointed by the by a collegium that is headed by that Chief Justice, have a tendency to get over-assigned to Constitution bench. Chief Justice who's so there is a correlation there, and then there are some judges who get completely frozen out of Constitution benches. So what happens is, if you had a completely random allocation, if there was no strategic allocation happening, if it was completely random, you would think that the Chief Justice would have as much of a chance as any other judge to be assigned on a bench. You would think that the Chief Justice would be dissenting on the Constitution bench at approximately the same rate as he would when he was not a Chief Justice, and as you would in any other bench. That is not happening. You would think that judges by and large might have either similar dissenting rates, or their dissenting rates would be consistent. And it is true for every other judge except the Chief Justice. So you know that there's something else happening. This is not random allocation. This is strategic. This is the allocation that is happening is strategic. And we have the data. This data has been there actually for some time. It's just that it's gone from being an arcane, arcane academic interest to something that is really at the core of the crisis of the institutional credibility of the court in the present moment.
Thanks, Aparna, and that's absolutely fantastic research that you're doing. I can't wait to read the papers and the reports that you will be producing on this, because I think what is also happening, and I want to inform our listeners generally, is that more and more people, we mentioned Nick Robinson, there's also Madhav Ane and Subhankar Dam and a lot of others who are now taking a very data-driven approach to our judiciary. We are not just studying, the judgments to say what they say about this, what they say. I can imagine that 10 years ago, if you and I were to have this conversation on Master of the Roster, we would have looked at all the judgments, some notable controversy here. But now we feel that, we have to bring the data into the discussion. And it's fascinating because if I have to very quickly summarize what a lot of the very important points you make, the Chief Justice of India determines the direction of the court. The Chief Justice of India can determine the outcome of a certain kind of case. And the Chief Justice of India can influence the way in which the judges think, right? So we may say that Chief Justice of India is just the senior most judge among the judges, but this is one office. The occupier of this office has such an important role to play. And I think what your research has really brought out is how much of a role the Chief Justice of India plays in shaping the Supreme Court. And I don't want to go into specific examples. A few came to my mind while we were discussing, but and I want to bring the discussion somewhat back to the topic of the Master of the Roster, because the other thing that which has become a subject matter of controversy is which cases are listed and which cases are not. Because the data that you have presented looks at cases that were listed and heard and argued and so on. So what I sort of wanted to bring our discussion also is that the Chief Justice plays such a huge role in deciding which cases get heard, right? Both in terms of on a day-to-day basis, but also if a Chief Justice says that I want to hear this case and dispose it off quickly, it will happen. But no other judge has that power. So just I thought we would discuss it a little bit. But before we get into the discussion, those of you who have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box on the on Zoom. We will try and answer them during the course of our discussion, or we'll come back to it in the last 10 minutes. But Aparna, on the topic of listing.
Right. So, I mean, the listing power again is of two kinds, and each of them is problematic, right? One is that each Chief Justice comes up with their own priorities. I mean, some of this, okay, let me take a step back. Some of this is a result of the nature of the office of the Chief Justice, which is of a very short duration, right? So it is, it's a seniority norm, and there are very, very good reasons for why it is a seniority norm, but that means that each Chief Justice has a very short duration on top. And every Chief Justice comes in with their own agenda for reform and their own agenda for, doing things for the institution. And one of the things that Chief Justices over the past few years have been doing is to have their own list of priorities of cases that should be heard on priority. This, of course, comes up because this is a court that has a huge supply side issue, right? It has too many cases, too few judges, too little judicial time, and so it is struggling to meet up with the demand for judicial services. So you have to have some kind of a priority. Now, each Chief Justice comes up with their own priority, which means that in every few months, the prioritizing of cases changes and flips and turns.
Yes.
There are judges who will set up special benches for tax. There are special judges who will set up special benches for social justice, and then things will change when the next Chief Justice comes around. So there's no institutional stability also in terms of the priorities that the court should have. So that is about listing as a whole, but also the Chief Justice has the power to, the mentioning power is with the Chief Justice. You can go to the Chief Justice and mention a case and ask for an early listing and an early hearing because of, some exigency. And that means that there are cases that can jump the queue, right? And which cases get to jump the queue very often depend on, and Vidhi has done pioneering work on this, on the face value of the face value of the advocate who is deciding the case, the senior advocates typically, and that is why senior advocates charge so much for that hearing. So we were looking at, and I mean, again, this is not our work, this is work that we borrowed from others who've done pioneering work on this, but and I keep saying pioneering, but it's just also new that everything is pioneering.
Yes, it is.
But the people who've studied the time that it takes for admission matters to be heard, and on average it takes about 93 seconds for the court hears only each admission matter only for about 93 seconds. It's
Yes.
even less for mentioning
Yes.
is perhaps a tenth of that. So in a 9 or a 10 second that you have before the court, you have to convince them that this matter should be urgently listed. And in that case, the court, it's not as if the court really has much to go on, except perhaps the value that they place to what to the lawyer in front of them, or that one sort of bolt of the blue kind of argument that that lawyer can make in 10 to 15 seconds that the lawyer might have. So
Yeah.
that kind of a mentioning culture, which one allows for some cases to jump the queue, other cases to not jump the queue, is itself problematic. But it depends again on the priority that the particular chief justice gives to matters of a certain kind, and
Right.
it leads to concerns that some urgent matters are not being listed, while other urgent matters of a similar type or that don't appear as urgent are being listed ahead of schedule.
Yeah, and for those of you who follow court proceedings, those of us, I think, Aparna also included, who have sort of been in the Supreme Court, know that the reality, even today with live tweeting and with such journalists who do such good work, they don't capture the chaos that is the Supreme Court in a given day. And even the sanitized version that we are seeing on video, like of the hearings, when the Supreme Court was functioning in real life, to me that 93-second figure seems, wow, they take that long. I've been in courts where 93 seconds was how long it would take to dispose of 10 cases, because that's how the judges sort of are forced to use their time, because they have such little time and they have to allocate so many, and they have to hear so many cases, and all of which also means that face value, as we call it, the senior advocate, and you refer to our researcher, that senior advocate is so important. So which is where I think we have to, I think we sort of agree on this. This is a kind of pathology of the institution. There's something fundamentally broken, that we shouldn't just make this about this CJI was like that, or that CJI was like this, or this judge was like that. We are just going to keep having these instances come up, which make us wonder, is this an institution at all, or is it just a collection of men and women who just do their own thing? And I think that is, to be very honest, missing from this discussion. And I mean the larger public discourse about the Supreme Court. People see individual cases, individual outcomes, and wonder, why is the court doing this? But I think what your research has shown, and what we are realizing more and more, is that these are some fundamental problems with the way in which the court itself is structured and how the court itself is functioning.
Can I
I just
just
sort of,
sorry?
yeah,
Can I
yeah,
just add to that to say,
yeah.
you know, I just want to make sure that at least no one goes away with the impression that this is the most important thing, right?
Oh,
The
sure.
most important thing about the court is, of course, its output, and
Mm.
there is so much to be concerned about the output, the direction in which this court is going in terms of its output.
Mm.
All that I think we are saying is that you
Mm.
cannot only focus on the output, you have to see the institutional conditions which enable some of those outputs to happen. And that, so that
Sure.
it's not only a matter of ideology, it is definitely a matter, I mean, at least my personal view is, it is definitely a matter of ideology, but it is not only a
Mm.
matter of ideology.
Okay.
Ideology
Yes.
can be constrained by institutional constraints to some extent, and unfortunately what has happened is that there is no institutional constraint, or there's very few institutional constraints that are operating upon the Supreme Court, which
Yeah.
is, in a recent piece, my co-authors and I argued that this is operating on the rule of whim,
Yeah.
and that's pretty much what it boils down to. It's the whim of the Supreme Court, it's the whim of individual judges that really carries the day, as opposed to any institutional or principled constraints on the power
Yes.
of the
Absolutely. And for me, it's a sort of what we call cognitive dissonance. Every day we see some administrative law case or the other which comes up to the court, where the court says, what is this? Don't you have rules? Why don't you follow the rules? Or you should make the rules where there are none, or we'll make the rules for you if there are none. But when it comes to their own functioning, the court seems to have this blind spot, just Just sort of, trust us to get it right. Don't question us. Don't ask us about this. And and some of the questions that are coming up are about this. So I'll just go to this last topic, which we had intended to discuss. How do we fix this? There are a couple of questions which have come up, which say, is it about putting an authority above the Chief Justice? Is it about taking away this function of the master of the roster and giving it to the collegium? Is it about, setting down a certain set of rules? Where do you think the path for reform follows? Because I guess a lot of our reform has focused on the external aspects. How do we appoint judges? Should they have tenures which go to X number of years, or what should they not be allowed to do post? I mean, all of those are valid to discuss, but internal to the court, right? How the court functions. I think there's a question of how do we reform this situation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. And I would say that there's no one single magic bullet. I do think that the master of the roster point and problem is, I mean, you can address it on its own, but you also need to look at the larger institutional context in which this power is operating. So let me first lay out the institutional context and then get to the master of the roster power itself.
Yeah.
The institutional context, as I said earlier, is that we have too many cases, too few judges. Right.
Yes.
And so therefore, who gets to hear what, when, and how becomes very important. And we really need to therefore first ask the question, what is the role of this court? This was never supposed to be a court of ordinary court of appeal, a final court of appeal in the ordinary sense. This was an extraordinary appellate power that the court had. Today, I mean, our figure shows that about 92% of cases in the recent past of the court's docket are just SLPs, right? So are appeals from lower courts, and it's increasing. I mean, a few years ago, the figures were around 86-87%. It's just increasing. So the bulk of what the court is doing is appellate work, and not to discount the value of appellate work, but there is very little evidence that what they're doing is actually remedying what high courts are doing. Their reversal rate is only in the 50s, which means that half the cases that they take, they decide not to reverse ultimately. So it's not as if there's such profound injustice that is happening at the lower level that they need to exercise this kind of supervisory power. It is just another layer of appeal that is there in the court. And unfortunately, we've gotten caught up in this kind of thinking that access to the Supreme Court is access to justice. Right.
Yes.
And so that if you do not provide easy access to the Supreme Court on the appellate side, I'm saying something different from what the Chief Justice of India was saying.
Yes, I was going to come to that, but yeah.
On the appellate side, that having another layer of appeal is part of access to justice. What that is doing is crowding out what was supposed to be the main function of the Supreme Court of India, which was its Article 32 jurisdiction. I mean, juxtapose the fact that on the one hand, Dr. Ambedkar was saying that this is the Article 32 power is the heart of the Constitution, very soul of it. To the Chief Justice of India saying in open court that we're trying to discourage Article 32 petitions, when what you should be doing is discouraging SLPs, right? So one is, of course, you really need to think about the role of this court. And do you see this as a constitutional court engaged in big constitutional questions, or a routine appellate court? So only when you resolve that problem that you have a manageable set of cases then to deal with. And there you start thinking about structural issues. There is right now, the Supreme Court has refused time and again, as you mentioned, to put any constraints, again, principled or institutional, on the power of the Chief Justice, the master of roster power of the Chief Justice. And there are two policy options that were given to them in these cases. One which said that have a set procedure. For example, have judges assigned to the Constitution bench by seniority. That didn't happen. Or that the power should be exercised by the collegium. The power of master of the roster should be exercised by the collegium, which didn't happen. I would think that there are a lot of powers that are everyday of everyday powers that would be very difficult to be exercised by the collegium. So you have to mark a matter. Some judges recuse themselves. You have to mark the matter to someone else, so on and so forth. You can't keep going back to a collegium and wait for a collegium, which anyway, we know the history of the collegium's sort of frequency of functioning, to wait for the collegium to decide those cases. So you need an institution, an authority, and a single person authority to be deciding those cases. But there has to be a mechanism of checking that. And again, moving away from case specific rostering to subject wise rostering, including having set constitution benches, right? So that any constitution bench matter in a given point in time is just going to go to a set bench, is possibly going to be more effective than this kind of ad hoc allocation of cases to constitution benches. I mean, so to me, it appears that the collegium option is not really an option,
Right.
A workable option. But this kind of set process is likely to provide some constraint at least on the master of the roster power. If the Chief Justice needs to depart from it, the Chief Justice has to give reasons in writing.
Okay.
Right. So I mean, have a higher burden. That, and this is I'm not saying something that's very drastically different from what the Supreme Court says on administrative law matters, as you well know, that there are decisions that single authorities take for the entire organization, but you have a burden of reason giving. And that burden of reason giving cannot, just because it's the Chief Justice of India, cannot go away. And I mean, I know I was pulling your leg about this before we started, but this is one of the reasons why I think, thinking about the court as a conscience keeper of the constitution, etc., can sometimes become so internalized by the judiciary in terms of, they start believing this own myth. And that is where some of this, I think, is coming from, thinking that, whatever we do is justice because we are called justices. We are the Supreme Court. We are not answerable to anyone. We are protectors of the constitution. So of course you have to have faith in us. No, of course we don't have to have faith in you. You are a public authority exercising public power. You're accountable to us. I think so. I mean, sometimes I think that they believe their own hubris a bit too much.
No, that's right, and that's a very important point. I think that hasn't seeped through the judicial culture. I feel personally, you have the odd judge who does say, I'm a public servant, I have to act in this way. I believe it was a judge of the Madras High Court who put out detailed statistics of his own disposal. Another judge put out his own assets before it became like a thing to do. So you've had individuals like Justice Muralidhar and others who've shown this, I believe in this kind of accountability, but it hasn't seeped through our institutional culture. I think that is like at the heart of this problem. That, it was great when it was a small institution for the elites to believe everything will go by trust. But, if you're working as a public body under a constitutional form of government, you have to show this level of accountability. A lot of questions have come in, so I'll just sort of go through some of them before we move on to further aspects of our discussion. There was one very interesting question come from Ronojoy, and I'll just read it out. The court has been accused of being partial to the government of the day since 2014. Does your data back these claims? And if it does back these claims, why do you think this is so? And I think it's not just about 2014 also. And is it because the institution as a whole is under pressure, or is it individual CJIs?
Ronojoy, I don't want to say anything from our data because, frankly, our data backs it up so frighteningly well that we are concerned that our data is wrong. So we are retesting our data. And I mean, I don't know where we'll go with that, but we are both retesting our data and we want to retest our inferences to see whether it can't be. I mean, we refuse to believe that the statistics line up so well. But so let me put that aside and say that what happens is when so much power is in the hands of one single person, and I don't mean to only because we are subject to the contempt jurisdiction of this court. I don't mean to cast aspersions on any individual Chief Justice, but just to say that when all the power is vested in the hands of a single chief justice, then you have just that one chief justice who needs to be turned in order to for any for the court as a whole, or for a large part of the court to be turned. And that's really what Indira Gandhi was trying to do, as Gadboy shows, through his work. And again, this is just to say, the Gadboy piece is a 1978 article from the Banaras Law Journal. Fantastic piece, should read. But so the point is, and I think the institutional concern is that the independence of the judiciary then rests in the hands of one single individual rather than dispersed through 34 individuals.
Judges.
And that's the 34 judges. And that, I think, is a cause for concern, that institutionally you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, that's the very valid point to keep in mind, that even though we may say first among if this one individual exercises this much power in the institution, it's much easier. And I think there is also a lot of theories of regulatory capture which talk about the dangers of putting not just in an individual as a CGI, but any regulator, how it can allow that institution to be captured. So that's a great point, Dr. Aparna. There's a second question. Actually, this is this is a second question which sort of relates more to what can we learn from foreign jurisdictions. In a sense, is there something that we think is worth replicating? Should we learn from some of the other countries which have similar courts? Obviously, US Supreme Court, totally different. But say other courts which do the sitting in division, is there something that has worked that we should try from other countries?
I wouldn't know. I haven't done a comparative study, so I wouldn't be in a position to answer that.
Okay. So Sagar Sharma, who asked a study, here's an idea for the next paper that you want to write, any op-ed that you want to write. I think you should take up that research now and say that you should do this. There's a third question, which is again looking a little bit at another country. And this is how much weight would you place on permanent appointment, like with the SCOTUS, to combat this whimsy in judicial decision making? And I can sense where this question is coming from. This is asked by a person, RL, because it's something that I have thought myself. If somebody belongs to an institution, they think about the institution more than themselves. And I think somebody like Chief Justice John Roberts is an interesting example. Somebody appointed by a Republican president, approved by a Republican majority Senate, who has voted conservative, but has been known to say, I will break with my political background, where I feel the court's institutional future is at stake. We saw his shift in the Obamacare, the so-called Obamacare case, where he joined with the rest of the Democrat-appointed judges to uphold that law. We have also seen of late, for those of you who have been following the Supreme Court of the US, he's been siding more with the so-called liberal judges, even though he's more conservative than most of them on a lot of interesting cases. And one possibility, and this is again something that just think about, is if you are on it's hard for us to think about, but he's been a Chief Justice for 15 years now, right? No Indian judge has been a judge of the Supreme Court for 15 years. But in a sense, perhaps if you give like a permanent appointment to someone, will they change the way they perceive the institution and their own role in it, rather than I'm just a Chief Justice for like so many things and I'm gone from this picture? I just sort of thought I'd throw that question to you.
Right. And I don't think it's between the present system that we have and a permanent appointment. I mean, there are lots of pitfalls of permanent appointment as well. In fact, after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death and the appointment of Justice Barrett to the court, there has been a lot of argument in the US that we should do away with permanent appointment for the kind of dangers that they see in their system. You do have many countries, and many Commonwealth countries, in fact, that have set tenures, right? So you become a judge of the court for about 15 years. And then there are countries that have systems where you rotate the Chief Justiceship up and down. You have countries which have set tenures for the Chief Justice, even if you have the seniority norm. Because you have a set tenure, each person becomes a Chief Justice for a longer duration. And so there's some kind of institutionalization of each Chief Justice's vision, and it doesn't, change on a monthly or a, twice a year basis. So I do think that the option is not between life tenure and retire at 65 or retire at whatever retirement age you want to put up. There are different mechanisms that have worked, and I think the reference point for us should definitely be other Commonwealth countries which have similar judicial setups, but also similar constraints of, state capacity, state willingness, state good faith, bad faith, and a similar kind of legal and institutional judicial culture that we can
Sure.
definitely learn from. It's part of the work that my co-authors and I are doing, but we hope to be out with it sometime next year, where we'll be looking at some of this in more detail.
Okay. Thanks, Aparna. There's one more question, which has a couple of more questions which have come in. And this one, I don't want to go into the specifics of anyone's name, but I think you made a very important point about judges being frozen out. You mentioned this briefly in the course when you were talking about Chief Justices. But without going into any particular judge's name, could you just elaborate a little bit on what this has meant? Like, what do we mean freezing out? Was it just during the course of that particular CJI? Or was it that certain judges, no matter their length, just didn't find themselves on a constitution bench?
So, okay, let me first go to Gadboy's work. Gadboy was able to make the claim, which we haven't really studied in that detail, but Gadboy was able to make the claim that judges who tended to dissent, generally dissent more often, were frozen out of constitution benches. And that claim he makes, and he is able to show. We haven't done the kind of study that would be able to show that, but what we found was, for example, I mean, if you look at there is an uneven assignment. Let's take Judge A. Judge A gets assigned to 3 out of 5 bench, constitution benches that come up under CJI 1's tenure. And in CJI 2's tenure, even though there are 15 constitution benches set up, does not find place in any of them. And then in CJI 3's tenure is on all of them. So on and so forth. We have the example of people who are going to become Chief Justices and therefore are climbing up the seniority ladder. And you would think that, there'd be some consideration of them being on constitution benches, if only to give them some practice of being on constitution benches, but are not assigned to a single constitution bench till they become the Chief Justice themselves. And then they assign to all, and they assign all constitution benches to themselves. And this is a time period of 10 to 15. So this is just in the recent past, right? Again, I don't want to name names here. Papers will do that, but so that's the kind of concern, that there is no. If you would imagine that if there was completely random assignment that's happening, your chances of being on a bench would be roughly even. There'd be, of course. Statistical probabilities would change as you moved up and down the system, but you could predict what chances you have of being assigned to a constitution bench. You can't predict that on the basis of any other metric that we could think of. And then you saw this factor where there are some judges who are not assigned. So I think a third of the judges in the entire time period that we were there, a third or a bit more of the judges were never assigned to a single constitution bench. In that entire time period. And of the remaining, there was a very clear preference that Chief Justices had to some judges, and then they got frozen out for the next 2 Chief Justices and then find themselves back on for other Chief Justices, which is again also not correlated to the subject matter of the case.
No, that's very interesting, because so much when it is internal behavior of the court, right, in terms of who gets to be on what bench, we don't really get a very good sense of how it works behind the scenes. There was this Abhinav Chandrachud's book on Justices Chandrachud and Bhagwati, and how their conflict, so to speak, played out for the benefit of the court. But the way in which judicial behavior is studied, we don't really see it as much. And I think this is something that is worth exploring and examining. My colleague Deepika Kinhal has a question. Do you think an administrative cadre that will be in charge of all matters not concerning judicial decision making, could that be a possible answer? And and a follow up to that is, if we just left allocation of benches to an algorithm, like a software program, and there is one which is used, but I don't know how good or how often it is used. Is that a solution? Is that a potential solution to this?
Okay, I should say, this is my own personal bias. I'm a tech skeptic. I'm an algorithm skeptic to begin with. My stance to begin with is always skeptical, because I don't know what biases that might encode. But in this particular instance, I do think you need some kind of a human agent to look at a bench assignment, only if only because there might be good reason to do strategic assignment, right? For
Okay.
example, the subject matter might be such that you might want, you might want certain judges who have that kind of experience to be on those benches. You might want to, instead of waiting for a judge to recuse themselves, where you know that recusal is required, you might want judges to recuse themselves, so on and so forth. Those are, I think you can fit those into an algorithm, but there is a concern that some of these things will not get necessarily captured by an algorithm. So I would, before moving to the algorithm, I would want to know, what is the basis of that algorithm, who's
Okay.
constructing it, how, why, etc., right? But so that's one skepticism. But I do think that a standard bench, right? So you do subject matter allocation, you do a standard, have permanent constitution benches. I can show you the latest figures from the Supreme Court website as of 4th of December 2020. There are 480 odd constitution bench matters pending before the court.
Wow.
And these are largely connected matters, so it actually boils down to about 50 cases, but it covers 400 odd constitution matters. These are some of the most important matters facing the country. I mean, the relationship between the state and religion, since Ronojoy is here, the relationship between state and religion, electoral bonds, Kashmir 370, so on and so forth. I mean, some of the most important cases facing the country are just pending, with no end in sight, with no sort of date for hearing, so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
I do think that you need a permanent bench. There are always going to be constitution matters. In fact, the other thing that our research shows is that the bulk of the constitution matters that should otherwise be decided by constitution benches are now being decided by 2-judge benches, only because you can't spare the judges to set up a constitution bench. And that goes back to the point that I was making, that we need institutional reform. Unless we rethink the role of this court, if we continue down this mode of this being primarily an appellate court, we're never going to find the time for it to do its core function of being a constitutional dispute resolver. So I mean, so there's, I think, a larger point here. On the question of whether a professional cadre of judges, administrators can do things, I think yes and no. This is definitely a case of the administrative side sort of at the administrative tail wagging the judicial dog, right? But there are decisions that need to be taken, and those decisions have to be taken, I think, that impact the judicial functioning, that has to be taken. And I would trust, given their training in principles, so, and in a well-functioning judiciary, we would trust the judiciary to do that. The day-to-day running of the court, I think, will definitely benefit from having more sort of skilled management, sort of training, organizational thinking, etc. So at the lower and the mid level, even at some of the higher levels, yes, definitely having trained professionals who are trained in managing complex organizations will definitely enhance the working of the court. But the mindset, I do believe that the mindset of a judge, in an ideal world, the mindset of a judge, of thinking about rules, principles, looking at the bigger picture, and being oriented towards access to justice, not just sort of institutional efficiency, but looking at questions of access to justice, of right and wrong, justice and injustice, is really required to be the guiding force in how the administration is run. If we start thinking only of efficiency and I don't want to don't want anyone to have a takeaway from everything that I've said, or anything that I've said, that I think that efficiency in processing the judicial, cases through the system is the highest value of the judicial system. It's not, right? It's the quality of justice that is meted out. So at the end of the day, I think someone who's looking at that question, and I would think that a judge is more specially trained to do that than a professional cadre of professionals otherwise who are trained at organizational efficiency. And that's
Yeah.
the reason why I would think that should be headed definitely. The head decision making should definitely be by judges.
Thanks, Dr. Aparna. And I think we've just run out of time because the clock has just ticked over to 7, and we are very particular about keeping on time. But thank you so much. I think we really had a very enlightening discussion, and thank you so much for bringing out your data. At least as for me, I've come out with this with a lot more nuance and understanding about the structural issues which our Supreme Court faces. And it's not just about thinking of our Supreme Court as a judiciary, but also that a lot of these things start at the High Court level. And I suppose the biggest takeaway is that it's not just about fixing this master of the roster problem. Like we may frame it whatever it is. We have to understand that we have to make our judiciary run in a more publicly accountable, transparent, and efficient manner. And I think we've had a very interesting and long conversation. For those of you who are interested, this will be put up on YouTube shortly. Please do check it out and share the links where required. Thank you all for joining us on this discussion. Thank you, Dr. Aparna. I think on that note, we will close this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.